satisfied with the sessions. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. This session is being recorded, so if you don't want your name to be on it, then just put a nickname or something of that effect, to that effect. And if you look in the chat now, I'm posting the essence notes for this session. And if you look right above that, there's a discussion link for once this session closes, because we're keeping them cogent for people who have busy lives, raising kids, in the hamster wheel of the rat race that we're in economically. And so there's the essence notes underneath it. If you want to join the discussion afterwards, go to the other one. Without a moment to spare, I think we have a pretty good crew here. Thank you again for coming. If you look on the screen, they're being shared now. I'm going to do what I always do for the new people in the room. I'm just going to do a recap of the sessions we did before this. And I'm going to be shortening the summaries because I want to pack this into 2 minutes. We shouldn't be spending all our time on the old content. It's just to put into perspective how we got to where we've gotten. So I don't know if somebody wants to time me, but I'm going to aim for 2 minutes. I'm actually going to set a little bit of a timer here. Okay. So in the first session of Spirit, if you look in the notes, we said that Hegel was the greatest philosopher because he summed up all 3,000 years of philosophers before him in a concrete totality. The second session was about how the last 200 years of philosophers didn't seem to grasp him in that concreteness, but put him into a one-sidedness, and they didn't grasp his profoundness. The third session was about once you grasp Hegel, you realize it's a metaphysical dialectic that's in the world and in yourself, and it empowers you to, in your practical spirit, to change the world as world spirit. The fourth session was about getting beyond the stereotypes of Hegel as a totalitarian, a fascist, a sexist, an old-fashioned racist. All of those things do happen in history. They're just the first negation. The truth is the second negation. The fifth session is about starting Hegel. Where do you start? You start at the beginning. The beginning has this very special speculative kind of paradoxical nature to it. And if you follow that true thinking, it's called speculative thinking, you get into something called the circle of reason. The sixth session was about how when you get to the end of the circle of reason, it starts looking really religious. But genuine philosophy is not the negation of religion, it's the sublation for anybody who's religious in the room, and a holistic logic, a universal logic. The seventh session was about how we can win a Nobel Prize in this practical spirit, in peace, because the universal logic, when it's clearly understood, is peace. And it's what religion was trying to approximate. The eighth session of Spirit is about how the first moment of this universal logic is the first abstract negation. It's polemics, but session number 9 is that the truth of polemics is the polemic of polemics, or sublation. Session number 10 is a masterclass in sublation, which is Hegel's science of logic. And we're clearly noting it in modern notation with analytic Phrygian notation. The 11th session was about how you can communicate the ineffable. Like, what's profound about this masterclass in sublation is you're actually able to say what other people thought wasn't sayable before. And it's not a practical joke that we can win this Nobel Prize. So that's 2 minutes there. The 12th session was about how this logic has to be living, and it frees your spirit as the purpose of life. And the 13th session was about how the purpose of life isn't just to free yourself. Everybody's infinitely valuable and should be free. So the session today, the 14th session, SOS, stands for Sessions of Spirit, but also Save Our Souls. This is a practical philosophy that also changes the world. And today's session is called Genuine Philosophy, Curious to Know What Hegel Really Said. The one paragraph summary goes, Hegel states that what we must have faith. For a genuine philosopher, this seems ridiculously archaic in the light of recent science and quantum theory. Faith is a concept which has no bearing on sophisticated minds in search of truth. Although in his Encyclopedia Logic, Hegel severely reprimands those who place faith above reason, he surprises all by finding the sublation between the two worlds, in which they are both but moments of one eternal truth. Faith is the foundation of all actual scientific knowledge. Counterintuitively, he declares that authentic philosophers must have the faith that the world is rational. It has led to one of the most profound and mind-bending quotes of the last 3,000 years of recorded philosophy. It is, "The actual is rational and the rational is actual." But what does this really mean? If you go back to the essence notes now, we're on section 3, the dialectical unfolding of that paragraph. We left off yesterday by talking about how the purpose of life is destiny. True freedom isn't this abstract freedom, it's this concrete freedom where you have your caprice, but you also have necessity. And it happens individually and it happens collectively as a community spirit, where Hegel famously calls this sort of dialectic back and forth, the we that is I and the I that is we. You're supposed to actualize your highest potential. And we ended the last session right on the wisdom quiz. And you can see I put the link there if you want to take it. It's a way to take the theory and start getting practical, finding out where your potential is, where your philosophy is, and start clarifying. But where does this potential and this destiny come from? Well, surprisingly, Hegel does say faith, your soul, and the divine idea. Genuine philosophy is about concreteness. It's about seeing this whole, this totality, this universal logic. And it's not like modern philosophy, which is this abstract philosophy. And that's why we have philosophy fragmenting today. And a lot of people are confused. Sometimes it seems to create more obscurity with all the different types of philosophers and how difficult they are to read. And at first, Hegel seems no exception. When you read him, you have an experience. I'll get into that in a second. But the atheists in the group will be cringing right now. If this is what Hegel really said, they want no part of it, or they think I'm completely wrong. Soul, faith, divine idea, this is religion. Aren't we back at religion again? This is a regression backwards, isn't it, on the circle of reason? Well, when you read Hegel, you have an experience. When you read him, you have at first a very negative experience. But hang in there, my atheist philosophers. We're going to be talking about the atheist version of this more tomorrow. But for now, we're just starting. And Hegel says some pretty profound things in a religious way. But it's also simultaneously the universal logic. So if you were here before this, in the previous sessions, you'll understand what I'm doing more in a speculative fashion. I'm doing two things at once in almost every statement, or every paragraph at least. And you'll start to grasp the true freedom in the words. When you take the wisdom quiz, in a very practical sense, part 3 accelerates this kind of feeling of despair, this feeling that there's something wrong either with the test or with your knowledge. It's a very kind of negative, like very strongly negative. It might even give some people existential crises in a way. This sinful knowledge leads to sinful thinking. This is exactly what Christianity says. There's different versions of it for Zen Buddhism. Islam has a version, but all the religions have a version of it. But Hegel sort of ends with Christianity as the end of the religious mode. So, the judgment at the end of the Christian narrative, it says, you get judged. So if you live rightly, you go to heaven. If you live wrongly, you're full of emptiness and you go to hell, kind of thing. Basically, if you don't know how to use divine thoughts, if you're not in the spirit, if you don't know how to use the force, you're not fulfilled. You're not living a fulfilled life. So I'm going to show you a paragraph where Hegel says that he predicts this will be your experience. He's doing this on purpose. He's not writing in an incoherent way because he doesn't know what he's talking about or he's confused. So when people come to you, I'm not making this up. This is actually, my interpretation is true, but I think it's the closest interpretation to the way he was meaning to be interpreted. So paragraph 78 of the Phenomenology of Spirit reiterates this by saying natural consciousness will show itself to be only the notion of knowledge, or in other words, not to be real knowledge, i.e. kind of sinful knowledge. But since it directly takes itself to be real knowledge, which is exactly what sin does, it has, vanity and, all the vices. This path has a negative significance for it. And what is in fact the realization of the notion counts for it rather as the loss of its own self, for it does lose its truth on this path. The road can therefore be regarded on the pathway of doubt. The road can be therefore be regarded as the pathway of doubt, or more precisely, as the way of despair. Why the heck would anybody want to read a guy who's saying you're not going to like his philosophy? And he says that if you think you know the truth, you're going to end up probably in a greater despair, unless you basically rewrote your philosophy as his philosophy. And it's profound. Like if you try and understand him for too long and it doesn't click right away, in the extreme, you'll see there's a second quote there. Hegel actually talks about you can actually become demented if you stay in this kind of state for too long. So there are also demented persons with severe depression and complete despair who have only a feeling of negativity. So when you're reading Hegel's words directly, your understanding of life, the logic that is in you, is probably not the universal logic yet. It's some kind of abstract philosophy, some kind of fragmentation. And the best case scenario is probably a different starting point on the circle of reason, like the Marxists, right? So there is truth to the philosophy. Every philosophy has truth. We're not saying don't read other philosophers, but when you look at what he's writing, it's gonna negate you. So you're gonna project your truth onto it, your affirmative understanding, but at first it's going to probably negate you. That's like the 99.9% experience that people over the last 200 years have had when they read his words directly. And it will, if you read it for a long period of time, it should start making sense if you're integrating it. But if you're resisting it, these negative states can create depression, because your mind is linked to this universal logic in a profoundly practical sense. But okay, well, hold on. Point number 3 now in the notes, you don't just have a negative experience, you can have a positive experience when you read Hegel as well. And this is what he's really aiming for. This is sort of the purpose of why he writes the way he does. You'll sort of go through the sea of despair for a very long time. For me, it was about 1,500 hours. But then you'll have something happen to you. You'll have, in what religion is called, or Christian religion is called, a rapturous moment, where there's a brief alignment with this universal logic in his words through the cracks of your doubt. And this will lead to an irresistible curiosity, an odd kind of faith that compels you to want to endure the despair. It's a feeling that gets right to your heart that you've seen the true somehow, because it aligns with your experience in life. And this kind of faith, it is not just an intuitive faith. It is meant to realize that what Hegel is saying is not jargon, that you can comprehend it in your own thinking, and that he's not saying jargon, he's saying real divine insights through the cracks of our sin. So this is what the Bible and Christian religion are trying to hit on, is this problem of interpretation. And Hegel is starting with a very high standard, but there is hope. You can actually have a positive experience that leads to a gradually increasing resonance. It'll start to become more and more profound, but you'll have little islands at first. So this faith is really stated in Hegel's famous quotation as what is rational is real, and what is real is rational. If you look in the quote here, I took it straight out of the Philosophy of Right. I'll just kind of give you the meat and potatoes, guys. Hegel's saying something really strange here, just in the beginning of this paragraph. What he's saying is that everything that makes sense in the world and is true and is really actually there is rational. That means all the irrationality that's in our minds actually isn't really there in the world. It's this false thinking. Only the positive being is there, but you're sort of distorting it. And there's this back and forth between your consciousness and the world. And so he's saying, we'll finish the paragraph here. Upon this conviction, stand not philosophy only, but even every unsophisticated consciousness. What he's saying here is that even if you're not a philosopher, you're still operating implicitly as a rational being, or else you wouldn't exist in knowledge at all. So there's something inside of you that's rational, or else your world you couldn't comprehend it at all. So he's saying, no, this profound statement applies to everybody, even if you're not thinking rationally or you are thinking rationally. From it also proceeds the view, now under contemplation, that the spiritual universe is the natural. When reflection, feeling, or whatever other form the subjective consciousness may assume regards the present as vanity and thinks itself to be beyond it and wiser, it finds itself in emptiness. And as it has actuality only in the present, it is vanity throughout. So it's basically saying, you might read Hegel and think you have the truth, and that he's making up a bunch of mystical, stuff that doesn't make sense. Or if you are mystical, his mysticalism is wrong. His spiritual universe is not the right one. So you kind of put yourself above it automatically and say the negation that I'm experiencing is not my problem, it's his problem. He should write more clearly. And it's kind of a form of vanity. You actually need to engage with the ideas of your time, truly get into trying to understand if there's truth there, to really find out if you are sublating it or are the sublation of it, or if you're just stuck in the negative moment of reason, that first abstract negation with the writing. Against the doctrine that the idea is a mere idea, figment of opinion, philosophy preserves the more profound view that nothing is real except the idea. Hence arises the effort to recognize in the temporal and transient the substance, which is immanent, and the eternal, which is present. The rational is synonymous with the idea because in realizing itself, it passes into external existence. It thus appears in an endless wealth of forms, figures, and phenomena. It wraps its kernel round with a robe of many colors in which consciousness finds itself at home. So what he's saying is actually, there's this thing called the idea, which is this concrete totality that genuine philosophy is about. Abstract philosophy doesn't operate in this way. It operates in fragments. But when you really grasp the universal logic sort of immediately, it is this grand totality that is interconnected infinitely amongst itself. It makes infinite sense. And it's always immanent. It's always in us. It's always in the world. It's eternal. It always existed, and it's always present. We are the problem. We are seeing the world in an abstract way, and we're stuck in this sort of negative sort of religious experience, this sinful experience, and then we act from that. And the reason why we get caught up in this, in the last part of the paragraph, he explains it. He says, this idea, you can't see directly in the world. You see it through an endless wealth of forms. This is the particularity of nature. And if you don't understand how to extract the essence of this idea, this universal logic, if you don't know how to recognize it, then you get caught up in the sensuousness of it, the colors, the sounds, all the finitude. And so this rational is real and real is rational is to get beyond this play of forms and get to the truth that's hidden behind it or immanently in it. That's probably the more accurate way to say it. So point number 4, how are we able to recognize this rapturous moment where we realize for the first time that the actual is rational and the rational is actual? That our life experience in its most profound moments is actually some kind of understandable phenomena that we're never fully grasping consciously. How do we know what our fullest potential is? It's because the universal logic is paradoxically already inside you. It's only implicit though. This is your soul. And so here we get back into the religious language, and the atheists in point number 5 will say, well, this potential is no soul, it's just the subconscious mind. In modern reality, we don't talk about the soul anymore. Genuine science, which Hegel says in his writing is what philosophy is about, doesn't have to put in these archaic terms anymore. But let us continue anyway and say, well, the atheist version we'll talk about tomorrow, this is how we've sort of emerged. This is how the universal logic was dressed up. And we need to get the 85% of the human beings that are in religious consciousness to realize the universal logic in these terms. So they're still useful, but you have to get past that sensuousness, that code of colors that Hegel was talking about in the last paragraph. And so we have the soul, and because you are in the image of God, sinful knowledge doesn't just affect your thinking, but also your being, because God is thinking and being, it's thinking itself, it's being itself perfectly. Divine knowledge does the same thing. When you have divine knowledge instead of sinful knowledge, reason is not only something that you do, but it's actually who we are. It is our very being and the truth of who we are. The soul is this, but our connection to it is broken, at least in contemporary society. When you're being raised in an abstract culture, your thinking and your being, the way you move through the world, maybe Heidegger would have more to say about this, but the way you move through the world is also fragmented and fractured. And you project this fracturing onto the world, and it's very painful. This is why sin in the religious mode of consciousness was supposed to be something done away with by getting rid of knowledge itself. But Hegel says, you don't want to get rid of knowledge, you need to sublate it. You need to turn it into divine knowledge, into genuine reason. The rational is real, the real is rational. But there are still people who are still in touch with this divine reason, this universal logic. And we blow them off in contemporary society, but they used to run the world, like back in the pagan eras, like thousands of years ago. This was how logic happened. And these people claim to be, magicians, witches, sorcerers. Universally, they state that what gives them their power is that they are in touch with their soul. There's something that is inside them that they're in touch with. They might call it the source, they might call it different things, but it's this inward connection, in touch, is where this sort of recognition starts happening from. And so if you look at the first sentence of the next paragraph, it sort of starts with this dynamic of the inner and outer. And if you remember yesterday, I quoted another paragraph that started with the same kind of feeling. Everything has an inner and outer. And if you really want to understand it, actually understand it, you have to grasp the inner and outer of things. So the soul, Hegel says, is actual as this kind of identity of inner and outer. Embodiment or corporality is thus only the soul's work of art and constitutes the shape of the soul in which it feels itself. What he's saying here is that the soul is simultaneously this universal supersensuous logic that Hegel puts in the science of logic in a sensuous form. So it is in nature. It does have corporeity. And when you have corporeity, the soul first emerges in hypersensuousness. And this is what art is. So art is kind of the first version of the expression of the soul realizing itself. We're going to talk more about that tomorrow and the more atheistic sense, but that's why he's mentioning art here. He's just highlighting the sensuousness of the soul. When you grasp the inner, like when you grasp the actuality of it, you start with the art, but really you go further to actualize the soul more deeply. At first, you only feel it, okay? So art, feeling, it all kind of goes together, as we know stereotypically. He goes on, though, to say it is actual, it is effective, and something other than mere existence. And then he actually mentions the famous quote, what is rational is actual, and vice versa. He's making a contrast here. He's saying that the soul starts in feeling, it starts in this kind of artistic mode, it starts with intuition, but actually where it's going to end up is more than just this kind of existence, this immediate kind of existence. It has this feeling of rationality that becomes explicit to itself. And it doesn't just, its reality becomes that way to itself. But you can also have these kind of bad realities. For example, he says, a bad soul has existence, but no actuality. To grasp the soul as actual, you have to do this inner truth and outer truth. You have to see yourself in your outside world as what's in your soul. And when that happens, you have the inner and outer simultaneously, speculatively. And that's when you have this coherence that is the truth, the concept of yourself, or the concept of whatever it is you're examining, a tree, whatever it is that's living. Tomorrow we're going to get into astrology a little bit, but the scientific version of how the soul goes through mechanism to develop into this living kind of soul. But you can have a wrong way of doing this. You can have the wrong image, the wrong idea. Your thinking can be sinful again. The rest of the paragraph sort of talks about the soul in its truth. When it does this process of inner and outer properly, it's a mirroring. And when you have this mirroring done properly, you sort of have this this feeling of truth that the totality of the universe is actually being seen externally in explicit thought for yourself. It is this profound feeling of the world being ideal because the soul in itself is ideal. This is what the feeling of being at home with yourself is like. And a lot of people don't have that feeling with themselves. There's a lot of self-worth problems in the world. There's a lot of this depression. People are disconnected from their souls and they don't have this feeling. They're not doing this inner and outer properly because the abstractness of our culture, the abstract philosophy, the brokenness, the fragmentation prevents us from connecting. So we only got about 10 minutes left and a lot more to cover. But I'll just say in point number 6, the soul doesn't stop here. The soul is this immediate being at home with itself, but the rational is actual and actual is rational. Divine knowledge comes out of the soul and makes it explicit to you. It makes it explicit to the form. And this is what spirit is. So there's been thousands of years of confusion in the spiritual community between what is the soul and what is the spirit, right? Like, are they the same thing? Well, here we see that Hegel has actually sublated it and made it clear. The soul comes first and the spirit isn't disconnected from it. It emerges as a sublation out of the soul. And that's how we separate ordinary thinking from divine thinking or true thinking or genuinely philosophical concrete thinking, because we're coming from the ideality of the soul. We're making it more explicit to ourselves. and we're putting it in the right order. We're putting those terms on the right order in the circle of reason. You can also try and reverse the order and say that spirit comes first and then that creates soul. That's technically true, but you've got to rotate the circle, right? That's the speculative thinking. That's the right ordering. I covered this a little bit in Spirit Sessions of Spirit number 4, when Hegel was interpreting the story of the Garden of Eden. He was talking about it in the rational sense, where you begin with sinful knowledge, but then it evolves into divine knowledge as, you know, Adam and Eve's souls return to spirit, and the spirit reunites them back with God, which is genuine philosophy. The rational is real, the real is rational. So I provided a quote here about him talking about how spirit starts now. So we talk about, you know, everything has a beginning. So soul had a beginning, and then it sort of becomes at home with itself, and then it sublates itself into closer and closer forms to spirit. And this is happening in plants, animals. It only becomes explicit in human consciousness, though. But even in human consciousness, spirit is immediate at first. And when he says immediate, it means it's not complete. It's not truly rational yet. There's an abstractness to it. But the aim of spirit is to actualize this faith that the world is rational. So in the beginning, the world looks fragmented. And when it's fragmented, you become doubtful that the world makes sense. You're like, well, the world is crap, right? There's nothing. A lot of people are jaded and nihilistic, and they say there's nothing good about the world. You're just grinding through the sea of pain until you die. But Hegel says, no, the experience you get when you're first reading him is the same process you're going through with your actual life. At first, the world will negate you. The first part of the universal logic is the abstract negation. You can't get away from the abstract negation. You have to learn to embrace it as a part of your life experience in a process of self-development into spirit. And this is why sublation, that the essence of this movement of transcendence, this logical essence, is sublation. And when you grasp it universally, you can overcome this despair by actualizing your spirit through your life experience. But you have to have this kind of faith that it's reasonable to at least even try. And so if you endure, this faith kind of gives you this perseverance to eventually absorb the negations and then sublate them. You have to tarry with the dialectic, he says. If you don't tarry with it honestly, you won't get over the contradiction. You won't get over the negative moment of reason. He says that spirit in this immediate mode is just theoretical at first. So even if you have wisdom, the spirit of wisdom is inside of you, but you don't know how to actualize it. And the point of the rational is real and the real is rational is to make what is inside of you external to you so you can change the world. There's a practicality to it. And we say that the ignorant human is the one that only maintains a theoretical spirit. But once you start moving through the world, you start absorbing wisdom automatically. If you're open and you're not super traumatized, you start to absorb it and recognize it from your soul anyway. This is what the wise old man is. Older people, the seniors, are supposed to be the wise ones because they understand it implicitly. And they're starting to explicate it, but they don't know the logic. The logic is why we're sort of transcending and making it clear why people are wise. This is what the next step of spirit is, actually, a further clarification. So point 7, once you have this faith, you don't stop at the theoretical. It affects our very being, right? So thinking and being are in a dialectic. Thinking is being and being is thinking. They move together in speculative unity. This is the mystical nature of what God is supposed to be like. But taken immediately through intuition, it's just the image, but you're supposed to actualize the image. You're supposed to bring it out and live this sort of speculative, mystical way, where the soul is just an instantiation of this. It's just a single instance that grows into spirit, which is the realization of that image as the purpose of life. Religious people, that's why they talk this way. This is the truth. This is the truth that they're seeing. But it's in sensuous form. They're still sort of trapped in this code of color, stuff like that. But I'm showing you the truth of it. So religious people who are reading this, I hope you can see your truth. I hope I'm doing justice to you, at least in the Christian community. Later, we're going to cover Zen, Buddhism. We covered a little bit of Hinduism already. But in the end, we should all see our truths in this, because genuine philosophy is about sublation. It's about preserving the truth in your philosophy and ideology, but also canceling the limit to put you in the right order of the totality of absolute wisdom. So there's another quote here about, okay, now that we have immediate theoretical spirit, it moves on to an end. The end, remember what we talked about yesterday, the purpose of life is to be free. But freedom only comes to you when you grasp rationality as your end, as the purpose. Genuine freedom requires you to understand this rationality that is in the soul, implicit in you. You have to make it explicit to yourself. And when you make it explicit to yourself, not just theoretically, it starts to affect your being. It's a practical spirit, and you can start to change the world. So I want to end here by saying quickly that we've come full circle in a way. So point number 8 is we started with true being, the soul, but then through sinful thinking, through the abstract philosophies of our current culture, we get sort of disconnected from our soul. There's a few people that don't, but the vast majority of our culture does operate in this mode of being. But then we don't stay there. We get this sort of true being reinstantiated through this kind of faith that the world is rational. Remember, we're not making the mistake of, we're just going to be intuitive and there's a God beyond. You have to connect with it in feeling only. No, that's the mistake of religion. You're supposed to know it. Spirit knows itself as God. It doesn't have to just feel it implicitly and trust that. It can know it with certainty. And Hegel is showing you the universal logic of how to do that. We return to this true being, this divine thinking as spirit. We get in touch with our soul again, and we heal the abstractness in our souls. We get in touch with our inner child, and life becomes profound again. So this is where we're going to pick up tomorrow. If you want to ask questions about this, go to the Hegelians who want to change the world, or go to Cynthia's link in the chat, and we'll discuss this further. But tomorrow we're going to pick up with this, but we're going to do justice to the atheists. So if you had the emotional resilience to stay, then you'll see your truth tomorrow. So thank you for staying. This is the first moment of sublation. I hope to do justice to you tomorrow and raise us all to a higher, more profound level of what Hegel is saying. Thank you.